Years later, the people of Fenmere would remember the winter Eleanor Vale entered a dead glass house and altered the prospects of every tenant family on the estate. On the morning itself, no one came to watch her go except the servants, and they had been ordered not to speak. Snowmelt darkened the gravel before Vale House. Eleanor stood beside one trunk while her brother-in-law, Edmund Vale, held out a folded deed as if it were an unpaid bill. At 32, after 7 years of marriage and 11 weeks of widowhood, she owned what she wore, the box at her feet, and the ruined property described in the document. Briarwick Glasshouse, its adjoining potting shed, and 4 acres bounded by the north drainage ditch, Edmund said. The taxes are in arrears. You may surrender it now if you prefer sense to sentiment. Behind him, his mother watched from the doorway. Lady Vale had taken Eleanor's keys before the funeral, and that morning had claimed even the pearl comb Thomas had given his wife. Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Pike, had explained that the comb belonged to the estate because it had been purchased from household funds. Eleanor had not argued. She knew Pike's accounts well enough to understand that an argument made without documents became a performance for those who possessed them. She read the deed instead. Briarwick lay 6 miles north, beyond the tenant farms, and had been closed since 1863, when its head gardener, Abel Saya, disappeared after being accused of stealing rare specimens. The glasshouse carried 38 pounds in accumulated rates and repair assessments. Her widow's allowance, promised by Thomas but never secured separately, depended on Edmund's pleasure. "Why are you offering to cancel the arrears if I surrender it?" she asked. For the first time, Edmund's expression tightened. Pike answered for him. "To spare the family embarrassment." Eleanor folded the deed along its old crease. Her father, a nurseryman in Kent, had taught her to read a plant before he taught her to read a ledger. The angle of a bud, the color beneath scraped bark, the swelling that marked a successful graft. He had left her a narrow pruning knife, linen packets for seed, and the conviction that dormancy was not death. The Vales had treated that knowledge as a charming defect until Thomas's lungs failed and Eleanor's skill with herbs, humidity, and careful observation made his last year bearable. "I will keep Briarwick." Lady Vale turned inside without farewell. Edmund gave a small laugh, but his hand closed hard upon the head of his cane. By noon, Eleanor was riding north in a carrier's cart with her trunk, her father's tools, 9 pounds 14 shillings, and the deed buttoned inside her coat. At the last bend, she saw Briarwick standing beneath a pale sky, a long iron and glass structure joined to a low stone service house, its central dome fractured, its ribs black with rust, and ivy thick over the eastern elevation. More than half the panes were broken. Laurel and bramble had conquered the path. The furnace chimney leaned away from the wind. The carrier, Joseph Bell, set down her trunk under the potting shed eaves. "Village says Say stole orchids worth a king's ransom. Plants do not survive 16 years in a locked case. Village says he did not leave willingly either." Joseph looked toward the dark glass and declined the 6pence she offered. Before he drove away, he pointed to a cottage beyond the ditch where smoke rose from one chimney. "My sister Ruth keeps house there. If the roof comes down, shout before it finishes." The glasshouse door resisted until Eleanor cut away ivy and drove the swollen lower panel with her shoulder. Inside, cold air smelled of wet iron, leaf mold, and old ash. Broken staging leaned over planting beds filled with nettles. The glazed dome scattered weak light across a tiled center walk. Labels lay under moss, their ink long washed away. She worked until dusk to make the potting shed habitable. Its roof leaked in 3 places, but the stove drew, and a horsehair mattress remained on an iron cot. She spent 1 shilling and 8pence at Fenmere for bread, candles, lamp oil, oats, and a second-hand blanket. The shopkeeper stared when Eleanor gave her name. Outside, 2 boys whispered, "Plant thief's widow," before remembering she was not Say's widow at all. That night frost silvered the sound panes. Eleanor walked the central aisle with a lamp, marking hazards in chalk. Near the northern bed, The flame trembled, though the external vents were shut. She knelt and found a thread of green beneath the frost, a vine no thicker than twine, running in 3 deliberate curves before disappearing under a stone curb. She scraped its bark with her father's knife. The tissue beneath was moist and vividly alive. No hardy English vine made such a leaf scar. Nor could any root remain active in soil this cold. Eleanor pressed her palm to the bed and felt, very faintly, warmth. When she lifted the lamp, muddy prints crossed the tile behind her. They were recent, narrow at the heel, and led toward the ivy-covered eastern wall, where no door appeared on the plan attached to her deed. Eleanor slept with the pruning knife beneath her pillow. Sleep came only in fragments. Each noise acquired intention. Rain in the gutter became a cautious hand, the settling stove became a boot on tile, and ivy scraping glass became fingernails. Shortly after 2, a deeper sound moved through the floor. 3 slow knocks followed by a rush of water. Eleanor rose, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and set the lamp low so that anyone outside would not see her shadow. The prints remained empty. At the northern bed, however, moisture had gathered on the underside of a leaf, while frost whitened the tiles around it. She placed 3 shallow saucers at intervals along the warm curb and marked their positions with chalk. By morning, the eastern saucer held twice as much condensation as the western one. The unseen source lay behind the wall, not beneath the furnace. It was the first measurement in a place governed until then by rumor. Before breakfast, she examined the deed's attached plan at the small potting bench. It had been folded so often that the eastern boundary was nearly erased. Holding it against the window, she saw a second set of lines pricked into the paper. They were not additions in ink, but impressions left by a harder drawing laid above it. One suggested a channel running north from the glasshouse. Another ended at a square no longer shown. Eleanor rubbed no charcoal over them, knowing that might damage the deed. Instead, she copied their positions by angled lamplight into the back of her father's old propagation notebook. The notebook contained his final letter to her, written when Thomas's illness had already confined her to Vale House. Her father had urged her not to mistake permission for ability. "A locked gate may keep out the best gardener," he had written, "but it cannot make the field barren." Eleanor had resented the sentence then. He had died before she answered it. At Briarwick, among broken glass and a plant alive without permission, she read it until dawn widened the cracks in the roof. At dawn she found no intruder, only a loose pane clicking in its frame. She followed the footprints to the east bed, where they vanished amid fallen plaster. On the outside of the wall, ivy formed a solid green curtain. The ground beneath it had not been disturbed, but a soot-black smear marked one iron ventilator waist-high on the stonework. Ruth Bell arrived carrying broth and an expression prepared for refusal. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 40, with red hands and a widow's black ribbon gone brown at the edges. "Joseph said you had neither hens nor sense," she said. "Broth may help with one." Eleanor accepted it. Ruth's husband had died in a threshing accident, and she supported 2 daughters by washing for the village and taking in mending. Briarwick, she explained, had once employed 23 men and women. After Abel Say vanished, Lord Vale dismissed them within a month. The glasshouse's experimental fruit and medicinal plants were burned, supposedly to prevent disease. Was Say a thief? Ruth looked down the length of ruined glass. "He paid my mother 2 shillings extra when the youngest was ill. A man may be kind and still steal. But he left his coat in the bothy, and February is a poor month to run." Eleanor showed her the living vine without describing the footprints. Ruth crossed herself, then looked embarrassed. "It is fed by heat and water," Eleanor said. "That is engineering, not a ghost." The first necessity was shelter. Eleanor paid Joseph 5 shillings to patch the potting shed roof and brace its door. She bought oiled cloth for the worst break over the western bed, salvaged intact panes from collapsed cold frames, and closed the glasshouse's internal doors to protect a single bay. For 10 days she cleared debris, sorted iron fittings, and dug drains clogged by roots. Her hands blistered through her gloves. Twice she misjudged the weight of wet staging and had to call Joseph rather than let pride bury her beneath it. The villagers did not soften. Children threw pebbles against the glass. The innkeeper required payment before serving her. A folded note appeared under her door. "Say dug too deep." Yet Ruth returned, first with a broom, then with her elder daughter Clara, who had a talent for drawing leaf shapes. Eleanor paid the girl threepence a day to copy every surviving mark before anything was moved. The vine's leaves emerged in pairs, dark green above and silver beneath. Its curves were not natural growth. Each bend had been trained around pins now rusted away, forming the old nurseryman's symbol for a protected mother plant. Eleanor's father had used the mark in his notebooks to identify stock from which future generations were to be bred. To determine whether the vine was one plant or several, Eleanor excavated by inches with a bone-handled dibber. The upper soil was common loam mixed with roof grit. 4 inches down, it changed to a deliberate bed of charcoal, crushed brick, wool waste, and leaf mold, materials chosen to hold warmth without drowning roots. Fine feeder roots descended through holes drilled in a clay plate. The construction was beyond anything her father had shown her, yet every choice followed a cultivator's logic. She showed Clara how to sketch the layers without disturbing them. The girl had attended school only until 11, but her eye was exact. When Eleanor asked her to draw the plate, Clara included a chip on its rim and the shadow of a stamped letter underneath. Together they lifted it just enough to read MV. No title accompanied the initials. Ruth recognized them but cautioned Eleanor against speaking Margaret Vale's name in Fenmere. Margaret had been 20 years older than her brother, unmarried, and possessed of a small fortune inherited from her mother. Village stories called her either a saint or a lunatic. She had paid women to label seeds, taught laborers to read weights and measures, and once refused to provide flowers for a Vale banquet while a tenant child lacked medicine. After her death, Lord Vale declared her experiments diseased and closed Briarwick. If she owned anything, Eleanor asked, why did her brother command it? Because he was Lord Vale, and she was Miss Margaret. Ruth's answer carried no admiration, only the blunt grammar of experience. Eleanor began searching public records rather than family memory. She walked to the parish office and paid a shilling for supervised access to old rate books. The clerk, Mr. Lyle, first claimed the volumes were too fragile, then allowed her half an hour when Reverend Hale happened to enter. Entries for Briarwick shifted oddly. The glasshouse appeared under Margaret's name for 15 years, then vanished from the assessment after 1862. A replacement page had been sewn into the binding. Its paper was newer, and the total at the bottom differed by exactly Briarwick's rate. Mr. Lyle would not let her copy it until Eleanor pointed out that a public rate book could not be reserved for the convenience of one estate. Reverend Hale quietly moved an ink bottle to her side of the desk. She transcribed the figures, the thread color, the watermarks, and the names of both men present. It was dry work compared with following footprints, but Eleanor understood that a hidden door could reveal a secret, while an altered account could prove who had profited from hiding it. She traced the stem toward the northern curb. Beneath a removable stone she found a narrow ceramic channel carrying warm water. It should have ended at the old boiler, but the flow came from the opposite direction. The deed's plan showed no watercourse east of Briarwick. Eleanor walked the boundary in sleet, measuring by chain lengths with Joseph's help. The eastern wall stood nearly 9 feet inside the stated property line. Between it and the ditch lay an ivy-covered bank that everyone treated as part of the structure. When Eleanor compared the exterior length with the interior aisle, 11 feet were missing. "A chamber?" Clara whispered. "Or a service passage," Eleanor said. "We prove before we imagine." That afternoon, a smart dog cart stopped at the gate. Edmund stepped down with Pike and a surveyor named Cresswell. Edmund wore country tweed too clean for Briarwick's mud. "You have had your adventure," he said. "I am prepared to pay the arrears and £50 for the deed." It was more money than Eleanor had possessed at once in her life. With £50 she could rent respectable rooms, purchase nursery stock, perhaps teach. A drop from the broken dome struck the paper in Pike's hand and blurred the ink. Why now? The ruin lowers the estate. It lowered the estate 11 weeks ago. Cresswell paced the north ditch without being asked. His eyes settled on the ivy bank. Eleanor saw recognition before he turned away. She refused the offer. Edmund's courtesy vanished. He reminded her that the rates came due at Lady Day and that unsafe structures could be condemned. Pike warned that the deed conveyed the building, but perhaps not subterranean works beyond its foundations. After they left, Eleanor found the northern curb smashed and the living vine cut through. She knelt in the mud, grief rising with surprising violence. It was not merely a plant. Someone had entered while Edmund occupied her at the gate and severed the one living witness to Briarwick's purpose. Then she saw the cut. The blade had crushed one edge rather than slicing cleanly. A cane knife, perhaps, or a cheap clasp blade, not gardener's steel. She trimmed the wound, packed damp moss around 2 surviving nodes, and set them in covered pots over the warm channel. If the root remained alive, the vine might answer injury with growth. That evening she began an account book. She recorded every penny, every repair, every visitor, and every observed change. Beside Edmund's offer, she wrote the time, Pike's warning, Cresswell's measurements, and the damage discovered afterward. Knowledge survived best when it existed in more than one place. She made a copy and gave it to Ruth. By early March, Eleanor had 1 Western Bay weathertight. She bought inexpensive lettuce, cress, and herb seed on credit from a dealer who had known her father. Using hot water pipes fed by the unexplained channel, she raised greens 3 weeks before the village gardens. The innkeeper who had demanded advance payment now bought 2 baskets for 7 shillings. Eleanor refused his attempt to lower the price and sold the second to the workhouse infirmary at cost. Her competence began to alter what ridicule had not. Farmers came to ask why their stored potatoes rotted. Ruth learned to take cuttings. Clara drew labels clear enough for printing. One skeptic, old Mr. Dobb, continued to call the place Vale's glass coffin, but he also brought a sound iron latch and left it without a word. The hidden heat varied with rainfall. On dry days it weakened, after rain it strengthened, though no smoke rose from the boiler chimney. Eleanor concluded that water descended from higher ground and passed through an underground reservoir, warmed not by fire, but by composting material or a deep-sheltered cistern. Abel Say had designed hotbeds, her father once said, that conserved heat by circulating runoff through fermenting bark. At the eastern wall, Eleanor stripped ivy carefully. Beneath it she found ordinary brick, except for an arched patch of different mortar. The patch was not a door. Its bricks continued into the ground. Near the arch, iron hinges had been reversed and buried under plaster, suggesting access from the other side. Clara's drawings revealed another pattern. Marks on 6 surviving plant labels, dismissed as inventory numbers, matched positions on the glasshouse plan. Read in order of leaf emergence rather than numerical order, they pointed to drainage valves. Eleanor opened 5. The 6th had been plastered inside the furnace room. When Joseph broke away the plaster, they found a brass wheel green with age. It would not turn. For 2 days, Eleanor soaked the joint in oil and warmed it gradually to avoid cracking the pipe. When it moved at last, water groaned beneath the floor. The warm channel emptied. Somewhere behind the eastern wall, a counterweight struck stone. A hairline opening appeared around 1 brick of the patched arch. They removed the loose courses slowly, numbering each brick. Beyond lay a passage only 3 feet wide, dry and lined with glazed tile. Its air carried the sweet, woody scent of old cedar. At the far end stood an iron door, with no visible lock, and beside it a slate panel cut with 3 shallow grooves like stems. Eleanor would not force it. The passage crossed ground included by the deed's boundary, but Pike's warning had taught her the difference between possessing access and proving title. She sent Clara to fetch Ruth and Joseph so that 4 witnesses could sign a description before anything else was touched. While they waited, Eleanor studied the grooves. They resembled the trained curves of the vine. She pressed them in the order the stem had grown. Nothing moved. Then she remembered that grafting symbols were read from root to tip, while she was facing their mirror image. She reversed the sequence. A concealed latch withdrew with a sound like a long breath. The chamber beyond was not filled with treasure. It held empty benches, copper pipes, a cracked stone tank, and rows of sealed zinc boxes raised above the floor. Along one wall stood cabinets with sloping fronts. Most had been emptied. On the center table lay a decayed leather glove and a broken pair of spectacles. Ruth stopped at the threshold. Those were Abel's. Eleanor did not touch them. A dark stain marked the table, but it was mineral runoff, not blood. In the nearest cabinet she found botanical sheets protected between waxed cloth, each bearing a pressed leaf, a date, and initials. The pages documented years of crosses among blight-resistant pear stock, medicinal foxglove, feverfew, and a climbing bean bred for cold soil. Several were signed A.S. Others bore the initials M.V. Margaret Vale, Ruth said. The old lord's sister. They called her Simple because she kept to the gardens. One zinc box contained seed packets, sealed in glass tubes with charcoal and wax. Most were likely dead, but the records mattered even if nothing germinated. Another held letters between Margaret and Abel, describing a plan to place the glasshouse in trust for workers' families. The final transfer had never been registered. A page had been cut from the letter book precisely where the witnesses were named. The discovery enlarged the mystery and weakened Eleanor's claim at once. It showed purpose but not completed ownership. It also revealed why Edmund wanted the land. An annotated survey marked Spring Conduit beneath the eastern bank, carrying clean upland water toward 3 tenant farms. The Vales had charged those farms for access to a lower, fouled pond. The chamber's other contents resisted easy conclusions. 3 trays held wooden models of graft unions, each carved to show how sap traveled around damage. A copper apparatus linked a rain gauge to a set of valves by floats and chains. Abel's notebooks recorded temperatures at dawn and dusk for 12 winters. Margaret's annotations asked not whether a plant was fashionable, but whether it would bear fruit in a laborer's garden, survive poor fuel, or yield medicine cheaply. One cabinet contained wage books. Women had been paid the same daily rate as men when performing the same skilled tasks, an arrangement rare enough to explain why elderly villagers still spoke of Briarwick with tenderness. Beside each worker's name, Margaret had entered small deposits toward a common sickness fund. The balance, invested through a York bank, had reached £212 before the entry stopped. There was no money in the chamber, and no certificate proving where the fund had gone. Eleanor nevertheless copied every account. Ruth found her mother's maiden name and the notation of 6pence withheld weekly. She sat on the floor, touching the faded line with one finger. "She told us Lord Vale paid for the doctor when I had scarlet fever," Ruth said. "She was grateful to him all her life." "Your mother paid," Eleanor answered. "So did the others." That knowledge changed the legacy from a private quarrel over land into an obligation toward families whose savings and work had been absorbed into the estate's reputation. It also gave Edmund another reason to seize the papers. If the old fund could be traced, the Vales might owe more than water fees. Eleanor made 3 inventories. Clara copied the botanical contents, Joseph described the structure, and Ruth listed names from the wage book. They sealed each copy in a separate envelope. Eleanor placed one with Reverend Hale, one beneath a loose hearthstone at Ruth's cottage, and one in her trunk. Only then did they begin carrying the most fragile sheets into dry air. At the back of the chamber, a service stair rose to a hatch. It opened beneath a rotted floor in an abandoned bothy outside Eleanor's gate. That was how the intruder had entered. Recent mud marked the steps. Eleanor barred the hatch and moved the papers to the dry potting shed, listing every item with witnesses. She left the cabinets otherwise untouched. Before nightfall, Cresswell arrived with a constable and an order alleging that she had broken through an estate boundary to seize family documents. Pike had obtained the order from a magistrate using an older plan that placed the eastern bank outside Briarwick. Cresswell demanded the zinc boxes. Eleanor produced her deed, her measurements, and the signed inventory, but the constable could only preserve the peace until a court decided the boundary. The chamber was sealed. The papers were carried to Vale House for safekeeping. Ruth wept with fury. Eleanor did not. She watched Cresswell lift the box of letters and noticed him leave the botanical sheets behind. He understood land and water. He did not understand plants. His ignorance might preserve what greed destroyed. 2 days later, every tenant who had bought Eleanor's greens received notice that purchases from Briarwick would be treated as debts against the estate. The innkeeper canceled his order. Rumor said Eleanor had forged Margaret's letters. A notice of condemnation was nailed to the gate, citing unstable glazing and danger to the public. She had 12 days to make the occupied bay safe or leave. Eleanor spent 6 of her remaining pounds on timber, putty, and 2 glaziers from the railway town. Joseph organized the tenant men after their work was done. Ruth fed them. Clara kept accounts. They did not repair the whole acre of glass. They braced the central walk, fenced the collapsed bays, reglazed the productive section, and built a covered public entrance. Every task matched the inspector's written requirements. On the 11th day, the inspector signed the bay safe. Edmund responded by closing the estate road. Briarwick's deed guaranteed access by the customary northern way, but he ordered a ditch dug across it. Eleanor could reach the village only by a mile-long footpath too narrow for carts. Seedlings spoiled because Joseph could not collect them. The moral choice arrived in the same week. Ruth's younger daughter, May, developed a fever and a spreading rash. The village doctor prescribed rest and clean water, but the Bell's well had turned cloudy after the estate ditching diverted runoff. Eleanor could keep the hidden warm channel for her crop or open the old northern valve and attempt to flush the spring conduit toward the cottages. If she failed, she would lose the heat sustaining her seedlings, and with it her income. The doctor would not certify the well as the cause, but Eleanor saw sediment in the drinking pail and smelled manure runoff. 2 cottages downhill reported sickness. At Briarwick, she spread the recovered survey beside her measurements. Margaret's conduit divided at a buried junction. One branch warmed the glasshouse through a cistern packed in spent tan bark, the other supplied the standpipe. With the northern road ditch blocked, runoff had pressed silt backward through a broken flap valve. Repairing it meant entering the drainage trench at dusk, when estate men were least likely to interfere. Joseph shored the sides with planks. Ruth held the lantern. Eleanor crawled shoulder-deep through cold mud until her injured pride gave way to practical fear. One collapse would smother her. She found the iron flap jammed with a fresh wedge of oak bearing bright saw marks. The contamination was not merely neglect. Someone had disabled the valve after Briarwick began supplying produce. Joseph wanted to carry the wedge straight to the constable. Eleanor stopped him. A common piece of oak proved little. She wrapped it in cloth, marked the place and hour, and had both witnesses sign. Then she used a hook to clear the hinge. Her hands shook so badly from cold that Ruth had to unfasten her coat afterward. Back at the glasshouse, Eleanor calculated the cost. The seedlings represented 11 pounds in anticipated sales, enough to meet the rates and buy spring glass. The Bell family had taken her in when no one else would, but gratitude was not the whole question. If she preserved her private crop by withholding water from sick children, she would repeat the estate's offense on a smaller scale. Briarwick's hidden system had been built to join cultivation with common welfare. Its purpose could not wait for a court's permission. She opened it. For an hour, nothing happened. Then brown water surged from the cottage's standpipe, followed by a cold, clear flow that smelled faintly of stone. The glasshouse beds cooled. Eleanor moved what she could into the potting shed and watched the rest blacken overnight. May's fever eased after 3 days. Other families began drawing from the restored pipe. The conduit proved that Margaret and Abel's system still served the tenants, but it also gave Edmund a stronger motive to control it. Water fees amounted to nearly £60 a year. Pike offered a settlement. Edmund would waive every arrear, restore Eleanor's allowance, and permit Ruth's family to use the spring if Eleanor surrendered Briarwick and signed a statement that Abel Say had forged Margaret's papers. "You ask me to condemn a dead man because you misplaced the proof?" Eleanor said. Pike's eyes moved toward her account book. Proof is whatever survives proceedings. That night someone broke into the potting shed. Eleanor woke to smoke. Oil burned along the workbench where the botanical sheets lay. She dragged the first bundle outside, scorched her left forearm, and returned for the second until falling plaster drove her back. Joseph and Ruth formed a bucket line from the standpipe. They saved the ledger, half the specimens, and the western bay, but the roof over Eleanor's bed collapsed. In the mud beyond the bothy, Joseph found a silver match safe engraved with the initials H.C. Henry Cresswell claimed it had been stolen from his coat during the inspection. Edmund publicly expressed horror and suggested transient laborers were responsible. The fire was a serious defeat. Eleanor's lettuce crop was gone, her notes were waterlogged, and the condemnation order returned because the dwelling was unfit. She moved into Ruth's crowded cottage. Some supporters withdrew, fearing eviction. Old Dobbs said openly that no widow could fight Vale money and win. For the next week, the village divided along lines no map showed. 6 households signed a statement that Briarwick's water had improved after Eleanor opened the conduit. 4 withdrew their names when estate notices threatened to review their rents. The blacksmith repaired a warped valve without charge, but asked that his contribution remain private. Reverend Hale preached on false witness and lost 2 Vale family pew subscriptions. Courage proved neither pure nor evenly distributed. It arrived burdened with rent, children, winter debts, and memories of earlier punishment. Eleanor's own error worsened matters. Certain that the botanical sheets were the chief target, she had stored her original account book beneath the potting bench rather than at Ruth's. Water damaged its last 30 pages. Pike's clerk later suggested she had added the missing entries after the fire. She could refute him only because Clara had copied sales totals each Saturday and Joseph retained receipts for timber. The humiliation was useful. Eleanor revised her method, numbering every copied page and having independent witnesses initial each weekly total. Her burned arm prevented fine grafting. When she tried too soon, the knife slipped and ruined a surviving pear cutting. She sat among the scorched pots and cried, not gracefully and not only for the plant. Ruth found her there but offered no easy reassurance. "You taught Clara hands can learn," Ruth said. "Let ours be yours until yours mend." For 6 weeks, Eleanor directed work she could not perform. Clara made clean cuts under supervision. Joseph adjusted the propagation frames. May, recovered but thin, kept temperatures. Eleanor learned that competence did not become less hers when shared. Briarwick's future, if it had one, could not depend upon a single indispensable keeper vanishing as Abel had. For one bleak morning, Eleanor considered Pike's offer. Her burn throbbed. Ruth's table held more mouths than food. The legacy she had tried to protect seemed to have brought danger to everyone who helped her. Clara spread the rescued botanical sheets near the hearth and placed stones on their curling corners. "Mrs. Vale, why are these holes all in the same place?" Each sheet had been sewn once along its lower edge. The missing thread had left patterns of tiny punctures. Eleanor aligned the pages by date. The holes formed groups of long and short intervals, not random binding marks. Margaret and Abel had used a gardener's pricking wheel to encode information where a solicitor looking for ink would never see it. The key lay in the plant initials. P for pear meant page, B for bean meant boundary, D for digitalis meant deed. Eleanor decoded a sentence over 2 nights. Duplicate deposited Wesleyan School Fenmere under M.V. Botany Prize. Fenmere's old Wesleyan school had closed 10 years earlier, but its books had been transferred to the chapel loft. The minister, Reverend Hale, found a cedar portfolio labeled Miss Margaret Vale's Botany Prize, 1846. Inside, protected by school essays no estate agent had thought worth examining, lay a duplicate declaration of trust, a surveyed plan signed by 2 witnesses, and receipts showing Margaret had purchased Briarwick from her brother with her own inherited money before conveying it to trustees. The trust was to provide horticultural employment, clean water, and instruction for the laboring families of Fenmere. Abel Say was named managing gardener. If the trustees failed or the estate obstructed the purpose for more than 5 years, ownership passed to a competent cultivator in lawful possession who restores the works for common benefit, subject to confirmation by a court. Among the portfolio papers was a list of 3 trustees: Reverend Hale's predecessor, a York seed merchant, and Margaret's solicitor. All had died. The seed merchant's firm had failed, and the solicitor's practice had been absorbed by another office. Samuel Marin spent days tracing dusty indexes before locating a probate bundle in which the trust was mentioned, but not described. It established that Margaret's solicitor had treated the document as genuine during her lifetime. The bank receipts required equal care. The branch named on them had merged twice. Its surviving ledgers were stored in Leeds, and the bank resisted disclosing old accounts. A court request eventually produced an entry showing Margaret withdrew £600 from her maternal settlement on the day Briarwick was conveyed. 3 days later, Lord Vale deposited exactly that sum against gambling debts. The transaction explained why he could not openly admit that his sister owned the glasshouse. He had spent the purchase money while continuing to present the property as part of his estate. Eleanor also asked after the workers' sickness fund. The York investment had been redeemed by Lord Vale after Margaret's death, using a letter that claimed all contributors had been repaid. No repayment appeared in parish accounts or family papers. The claim extended beyond what Samuel could safely pursue in the first hearing, but he preserved it for the trust's later accounting. Every advance created expense. Railway fares, copying fees, sworn statements, and counsel consumed nearly £20. The tenant's collection could not carry the whole case. Eleanor sold Thomas's silver watch, the last valuable object Edmund had overlooked because it was being repaired when the household inventory was made. She mourned it after the pawnbroker counted out the coins. Thomas had failed to secure her future, yet he had not been cruel. Grief did not arrange people into the convenient ranks of innocent and guilty. Selling the watch paid for Matthew Bell's journey and certified copies of the rate books. It also ended Eleanor's private hope that some remnant of her marriage might purchase a quiet life elsewhere. Briarwick was no longer the insult she had accepted because she lacked alternatives. She was choosing it with full knowledge of the cost. One witness, a schoolmistress, was dead. The other was Matthew Bell, Joseph and Ruth's father, then a 19-year-old furnace tender. He was 70 and living with a married daughter in York. Eleanor did not celebrate. A duplicate could be challenged. The trust required proof that the original had existed, that Margaret owned the property, that the signatures were genuine, and that Eleanor qualified. She needed a chain, not a miracle. Her account book supplied evidence of competent restoration and public water use. Parish rate books showed Margaret, not Lord Vale, assessed for Briarwick between 1847 and 1862. The deed in Eleanor's coat established lawful possession. Reverend Hale's catalogue proved the portfolio had lain at the school since 1864, before the present dispute. Matthew Bell, brought south with money quietly collected by the tenants, identified his signature and described witnessing Margaret and Abel sign the original. He also told them what happened to Abel. In February 1863, Lord Vale discovered that Margaret intended the spring water to be free. He ordered Abel to surrender the trust. Abel refused and hid the duplicate at the school. Cresswell's father, then estate steward, locked Abel in the concealed chamber while men searched the glasshouse. Matthew released him through the bothy hatch. Injured and fearing arrest for theft, Abel fled to Liverpool under another name. He sent Matthew one letter from Canada and was never heard from again. Margaret died 3 weeks later after a sudden illness. The estate spread the story that Abel had stolen the collection and suppressed the trust. Matthew had remained silent because Lord Vale threatened to turn every Bell family out of its cottage. He carried that shame for 63 years. "Silence kept us housed," he told Ruth, "and kept every child after us paying for water that was theirs." The material legacy was not a chest of coins. It was the spring conduit, the productive glasshouse, Margaret and Abel's breeding records, viable cuttings from the mother vine, and the lawful structure for using them together. The vine itself proved to be a cold-tolerant climbing bean selected across 14 generations. Eleanor's salvaged nodes had rooted. Its descendants could enrich poor soil, produce food late in the year, and provide seed without forcing tenants to buy anew each season. The intellectual value was greater than any rare orchid. Margaret and Abel had recorded practical crosses suited to northern farms, work dismissed because one author was a secluded woman and the other a gardener accused of theft. Cresswell had burned what he thought were decorative specimens while leaving their code and the living stock intact. Eleanor engaged a York solicitor, Miss Ada Marin's brother Samuel, who agreed to defer half his fee after examining the documents. He petitioned the Chancery Court for an injunction protecting the conduit and glasshouse until the trust claim could be heard. Edmund countered that the duplicate was fraudulent, Matthew senile, and Eleanor an opportunist who had endangered the estate by opening ancient pipes. The hearing was held first before the county magistrates on the road obstruction and arson evidence, then in York on the property claim. Fenmere crowded the public gallery. Eleanor wore a borrowed gray dress that did not conceal the bandage on her arm. Pike's case depended on the older estate plan Cresswell had used to place the chamber beyond Briarwick. Under questioning, Cresswell swore that it had been copied faithfully from the 1852 survey. Eleanor's solicitor produced the duplicate survey from the school portfolio. Its northern boundary followed the drainage ditch exactly as her deed did. More damaging still, Clara's copies of the surviving plant labels included 6 tiny surveyor's marks. When set over the 1852 scale, they fixed the spring valves and eastern bank inside Briarwick. Margaret had used the botanical labels as permanent boundary witnesses because plants might be removed, but the iron label bases were mortared into the beds. Cresswell insisted those marks were horticultural. Eleanor explained each symbol and then demonstrated his error. The mark he called a rose was the nurseryman's sign for a mother plant. Its mirrored orientation led to the chamber latch. The living vine's trained curve matched the slate lock. The concealed passage could not have been constructed after the survey because its glazed tile carried a manufacturer's stamp discontinued in 1849. Joseph produced 2 numbered bricks removed in the presence of witnesses. Reverend Hale presented the school catalog. Matthew described the signing and named every person in the room. Finally, Eleanor's account book showed that Edmund had offered to buy Briarwick before she revealed the chamber, that Cresswell measured the disputed bank during that visit, and that the vine was cut minutes later. Pike had argued that Edmund knew nothing of the trust. His own purchase offer proved he knew the supposedly worthless ruin carried value, while the estate water books supplied motive. The magistrates could not convict Edmund of ordering the fire without direct evidence. They could act against Cresswell. A pawnbroker testified that Cresswell had bought the engraved match safe 2 years earlier, defeating his claim that it was planted by strangers unfamiliar with him. Under pressure, the laborer who dug the road ditch admitted Cresswell had paid him from estate funds. Cresswell was charged with arson and malicious damage. His altered survey ended his professional standing. Pike withdrew from Edmund's representation when required to produce his correspondence. The letters showed Edmund had instructed him to recover the water ground before the widow learns its use. They did not prove arson, but they proved concealment and bad faith. The Chancery Court confirmed Margaret's purchase through bank receipts and rate books, accepted the duplicate trust because of its independent custody and witnesses, and ruled that the estate's long obstruction had activated the transfer provision. Eleanor's restoration, possession, and opening of the conduit for common benefit satisfied the remaining condition. She did not receive Briarwick free of duty. She became its custodian under a renewed trust, required to maintain accounts, protect access to water, and apply income to the stated purposes. The ruling on the Workers' Fund came later. Pike's disclosed correspondence led Samuel to an estate cash book in which Lord Vale had entered the redeemed investment as miscellaneous garden proceeds. With interest limited by the court and several claimants impossible to trace, the estate owed £186 to surviving contributors and their descendants. Eleanor resisted calls to put the entire sum into Briarwick. It had belonged to individuals before it became evidence. Ruth received her mother's share. Some families took cash. Others elected to place part of theirs in the renewed sickness fund, now administered by 3 trustees chosen annually. Matthew declined his distribution at first, saying silence had forfeited it. Ruth refused that judgment. "They frightened a boy and profited from the frightened man," she told him. "Do not finish their work for them." He accepted enough to live near his daughter without parish assistance and gave the remainder to the schoolroom. Edmund appealed one portion of the boundary decision, but abandoned the attempt after his own surveyor refused to support Cresswell's altered line. His social consequences were quieter than a criminal sentence and more lasting than public shame. Tenant renewals were placed under independent review. The County Horticultural Society removed him as patron when Margaret's papers were published. Men who had welcomed him for his name began examining the accounts attached to it. Edmund was ordered to reopen the Northern Way, repay improperly collected water charges for the years not barred by limitation, and bear a substantial portion of the costs. To meet them, he sold 2 hunting fields. Lady Vale sent Eleanor's pearl comb through a servant without a note. Eleanor sold it and used the money to replace the potting shed roof. Spring did not transform Briarwick overnight. The Great Dome remained broken that year, and 2 eastern bays were fenced as unsafe. Eleanor drew a 5-year repair plan. Trust funds repaid the tenants first. Greenhouse income could not be spent twice. Joseph supervised masonry and ironwork for wages. Ruth managed packing and sales. Clara became Eleanor's first formal pupil, studying botany in the mornings and bookkeeping in the afternoons. Their first full year nearly undid them by ordinary means. A late frost split 2 supply pipes, aphids spread through the medicinal beds, a London buyer delayed payment for 6 weeks, leaving wages due on Friday with only £3 in the till. Eleanor refused to borrow against the spring. She sold reserve pear stock locally, postponed glazing in Ornamental Bay, and paid workers before herself. The trust's public meetings were untidy. Farmers wanted more vegetable trials. Reverend Hale wanted books. Ruth insisted on a proper washing room for women workers. Joseph argued that no program mattered if the central ribs collapsed. Eleanor had once imagined good stewardship meant finding the correct answer and enforcing it. She learned instead to publish the figures, state what could not yet be afforded, and let disagreement occur without treating it as betrayal. They chose the roof ribs first, then the washing room, then a modest classroom using salvaged timber. Eleanor kept Margaret's ambition, but rejected her secrecy. Minutes were posted at the gate. Seed trials were duplicated on tenant plots. Keys to the conduit valves were held by 3 people from different families. No discovery, however benevolent, would again depend upon one frightened witness or one hidden copy. The living bean required 2 seasons of testing before distribution. Its first crop was prolific but bitter when picked late. Clara found a note among the scorched sheets showing that Abel harvested it young and dried the mature beans only after repeated boiling. Eleanor printed the warning on every packet. Knowledge without instructions, she realized, could become another form of harm. They restored the spring conduit before the ornamental ranges. Clean water reached 27 cottages by midsummer. The workhouse infirmary bought herbs at cost. Tenant families received bean seed with one condition. Each household returned a measured portion after harvest so the common stock could grow. Not every specimen germinated. Of 42 sealed seed tubes, only 9 produced life. Eleanor recorded failures as carefully as successes. Margaret and Abel's pear stock resisted canker in field trials, but meaningful results required several seasons. A university botanist offered to publish the work under his own name. Eleanor sent him away and arranged for the papers to credit both original cultivators. In October, the cold soil beans climbed frames along the western bay, their silver-backed leaves repeating the pattern that had opened the hidden chamber. Families who had expected little from the stony north plots harvested baskets after ordinary beans had failed. The trust sold surplus seed to commercial growers and reserved the proceeds for glazing and instruction. Matthew Bell returned once to see the restored passage. At the center table, where Abel's broken spectacles remained in a small case, he placed the Canadian letter he had hidden for 6 decades. It described Abel's new life tending orchards near Hamilton and asked that Margaret's work be remembered if truth ever became safe. "It was never safe," Matthew said. Eleanor took his weathered hand. "No, people made it safer." Old Dobb never admitted he had been wrong. He became, however, the most vigilant guardian of the northern valve, and chased 2 boys from it with his stick. The innkeeper displayed Briarwick greens on his best table and paid the listed price. Reverend Hale opened an evening classroom in the repaired service house. Ruth's daughters no longer carried washing through winter mud. May learned pump maintenance, while Clara's exact drawings were printed in the first catalog of Valsay hardy plants. 3 years after Eleanor arrived, the central dome was reglazed. The restoration had taken thousands of hours, careful borrowing, sales contracts, and strict accounts. Briarwick employed 14 adults year-round, and twice that number during planting and harvest. No one became suddenly rich. Fewer children went hungry between winter stores and spring crops, and no cottage paid Edmund Vale for water. Eleanor lived in 2 plain rooms above the service house. She never returned to Vale House, though Thomas's portrait came to her after Lady Vale died. She hung it not in her bedroom, but in the public reading room, where his gentleness could be remembered without disguising his failure to protect her. On the anniversary of the fire, Eleanor walked the glasshouse before dawn. Rain tapped thousands of sound panes and flowed through gutters into the old warming system. The mother vine, now thick as her wrist at the base, grew beside the eastern arch. Its branches had been trained into no secret sign. They spread openly along wires above the path, labeled with its history and the names of those who had preserved it. Clara arrived carrying the morning account book. Beyond the clear glass, women and men crossed the reopened road toward work, their lanterns moving through the blue hour. Water sounded in the pipes beneath them, steady, cold, and free. Eleanor touched one silver-backed leaf. When she had first entered Briarwick, she believed usefulness was the price a discarded person paid for the right to remain. The glasshouse had taught her otherwise. Its value had existed while its panes were shattered, while its beds looked dead, while powerful men called it worthless. Restoration had not created that value. It had made the truth visible and placed it beyond one family's power to hide. She opened the doors before the workers reached them, and the warm, living air went out to meet the rain.